Hey guys, welcome to another video. Today I want to walk you through the sketchbook making process for 3 different sketchbooks, and we're going to be intentionally focusing on single sheet sketchbook designs today. So I won't be folding any pieces of paper in half or anything like that. We're just going to be using single sheets, and this can be really helpful in those instances where if you were to fold your paper in half, it would be smaller than you want it to be, and this way you can work with exact sizes. And let's go ahead and get started. So the first one I'm going to be structuring these 3 different designs in order in this video from least complex to most complex. So the first one we're doing here is the least complex one, and ironically it may be the one that takes the most time just because of waiting for glue to dry. Now, this particular design for sketchbook is called Perfect Bound Sketchbook, and if you've ever made your own sketchbook before, you've probably heard of this method. It's nothing relatively new or anything like that. I have all of my paper here cut to A2 size. I will put that up on the screen if that's not correct. I think it's A2. And I do have different types of paper here. So I have 2 sheets of sketchbook paper and then 1 piece of watercolor paper. So it goes in that pattern, 2 sheets of sketchbook paper and then 1 sheet of watercolor paper all the way through. And because this is going to be glued, I personally was not counting on the strength of the glue to hold the paper together. So I started by scoring all of the edges, all of that outside edges, so that the glue would have more of a texture and more of a rougher surface area to attach to, in the hopes that my glue would actually stay. To be honest, this is the method that I had the least amount of faith in, because I didn't think that my glue would hold all of my pages together. And if it did, I was worried that it wouldn't be flexible, or my pages wouldn't open very well and they wouldn't lay flat, and you will see how that turned out in a couple minutes. So after I had scored everything, I went through and applied my first layer of glue, and I used just an old brush that I had to do that. I am using PVA glue that I got from Amazon. I'll list as many of the materials as I can in the description below. What you're seeing here now is actually once that first layer of glue was completely dry, and this PVA glue does dry clear, so you can kind of tell when it's dry because it will be clear. I have these old clamps that I took from my father-in-law's wood shop, or that he let me borrow, and 2 pieces of board that I'm putting this in between. Just some pieces of wood also that my father-in-law so kindly prepared for me and cut to a specific size so that I could make these sketchbooks. And I'm going to be doing a total of 3 layers of glue here to kind of try to reinforce that binding a bit and give those scored edges something to hold on to. Of course, now we're just basically putting glue on top of glue to strengthen that sort of bond. And I also put a bit of packing tape on the edges of my wood so that it would not stick to the wood and like the wood wouldn't absorb that glue, and that did actually help. So here now we can see this is what it looks like after all 3 coats of glue. They do dry pretty transparent, a little bit of rough edges just because the tape did kind of like, the glue kind of did stick to the tape. But for me, this was the most surprising moment, was when I went to open up the sketchbook and saw that somehow my pages did actually lay really flat. And I was kind of in awe because this was definitely the easiest sketchbook to make, and I was not expecting it. But the glue, the PVA glue that I used, is very flexible. Now, there was one issue that I had, and that's what you're seeing right here. And that is that some of my pages were not cut straight. They were not cut perfectly. So this page, which was cut a little bit smaller, obviously it wasn't long enough to reach the glue, so that wasn't glued in all the way. So that's just a tip. You should definitely try and make sure that all of your pages are cut to the same length, or at least aligned in such a way that they're all going to come into contact with that glue. This is an old packing envelope, like an A2 sized packing envelope, that I have folded with 2 sort of creases in the middle for the center, and I'm just going to use this to cover my sketchbook. I really like recycling materials and using things over again, especially when making sketchbooks. And you have to forgive me for constantly including this plant. My husband got me this new succulent and it's adorable, and I couldn't resist including it in the video. So Yep. Anyway, what I'm going to do to adhere the text block, so my pages all together to the cover, I'm actually just going to glue the back page completely and adhere it to the back. I thought about binding this on the spine, but I knew that that would impede the flexibility of the pages and would cause them to not open the way I wanted to, and I didn't really want to play around with a fancy spine to allow that to still flex in a particular way. Again, I wanted to keep this method a bit simpler than the others, so I just glued the back page, which was a piece of watercolor paper, directly onto the back of the sketchbook. And then to allow that to dry, I figured I should just grab a giant stack of books and push it down, let it sit until it was dry, or to be honest, I only let it sit for as long as it took me to set up this next shot because I'm a little bit impatient. So the next sketchbook we are going to be making is going to be stitched. So we are moving away from gluing our sketchbooks and moving on to a stitch-bound sketchbook. This is going to be a Japanese style stitching thing. There's probably a more articulate or specific name for that, and if I find it, I'll put it on the screen. But this one I was actually pretty excited about because the stitching is very clean and nice looking, and what you're seeing me do here is aligning the outer edges, two of the outer edges of our sketchbook, so they will be straight. And I did that with the outer edge and the top so that those edges would be straight and the slightly less, the imperfections of the page cuttings would be on the inside where it's going to be bound. An interesting thing about this binding technique is that I'm going to be drilling holes through everything at once. So that's what I'm gonna go do now along this edge here. I drilled holes through the covers and all of the pages at once. So after that, I glued on my front cover to this piece of paper that I'm going to be using as a cover. And by removing this little slot on the inside, that's going to allow our cover to open easily, because the downside to this binding is that a lot of page area, probably about like 1.5 inches or so, is covered. I think it's actually 1 inch, but about 1 inch-ish is covered of the page by the binding. So you'll see it in a second. I was a bit worried that this particular method of binding would actually make it very difficult to open the pages because I'm just relying on the foldability of the pages. And because my intention with this sketchbook was to fill it completely with watercolor paper, which I did, I actually used a few different kinds of watercolor paper, and I wanted this sketchbook to be a swatching sketchbook. So a place that I would feel comfortable just mixing colors in watercolor and not having to worry about putting illustrations on every page or anything like that. It was just a place for me to study color mixing. So studying how certain colors mix with one another and creating it's basically a watercolor techniques, swatches, sketchbook. That's the plan. So I cut and am now gluing all of the outside edges, and by cutting at just like a 45-degree angle to the edges of the cardboard, we can fold that in and get nice edges. I used an awl to poke holes through the cover once I had everything taped and glued, and now I do wish when I was gluing that I had been a bit more careful, because you'll see that I did smudge some glue on the outside cover of this sketchbook, and that's never going to go away, especially because this is paper and not some special kind of cover. You can see a little bit better here how that opens and closes so nicely and easily, which that's definitely my favorite thing about this sketchbook is the cover. I really like the way that that opens and closes. I'm going to be using waxed thread for this binding here, and to appropriately estimate the amount of thread I was going to need, I believe that I went back and forth here across the length of the side to be bound like 6 times or so. Here I have a curved bookbinding needle, and to be honest, I got like a set of bookbinding supplies from Amazon, super cheap, for like $10, and I'll link that in the link, or I'll leave the link down in the description below so you can check it out. That's where a lot of this new stuff that I'm using came from. I originally thought I wanted to use a curved needle to do this. I'm not exactly sure why I thought I wanted a curved needle for the binding of this, but it ended up, already by this point I had switched to a straight needle because that was kind of silly, especially because for the most part I was going straight through all of the pages to the other side, so a curved needle wasn't really necessary for this one. Now I'm showing what you're seeing here just because I want you guys to see my struggle. So I actually had a fairly difficult time easily binding this one. I mean, the actual technique was fairly straightforward, but I think that my primary issue was that my holes were not large enough. So I'm going to try to show some of the binding here, even though it's kind of a mess, and this is why I don't show a lot of the binding so far, because I move my sketchbook around so much, and especially with this one I had so much trouble getting it through the other pages. But I just wanted to show you guys a little bit as to why I don't always show the binding, because if I did, it would look like that, which is kind of madness. We're gonna actually jump ahead now. You'll see the other one when it's all done. You'll see all of them when they're all done. But we're going to jump ahead to the last sketchbook now. So this is also going to be, of course, a single sheet stitch bound sketchbook. Oh my goodness, that was kind of difficult to say. I don't remember the name of the stitching method, but it's on the screen. That's what it's called. You can see it, and I'll probably be watching this as I'm finalizing the edit going, duh, of course that's what it's called. You silly person. Okay, anyway. So I marked out 3 holes at either end that were 3/4 inches apart from one another. And I know I didn't really say this before, but this video isn't really intended to be a tutorial. I just want to talk to you guys about my experiences with making these 3 different single sheet techniques, and I will leave links to probably like the best videos I can find for these different techniques. They're kind of all over the place. As in, you can find them all over the place, but I will leave links to those so you guys can follow actual tutorials once you have seen this video and decided which of these techniques may work best for you or that you would enjoy doing the most. So on this one, I'm definitely using curved needles, and I'm using 6 of them. This is a little bit crazy because I'm going to have to be binding each of these holes all the way up the column individually at the same time. So once I have taken my awl here and made sure that my holes on the cover are big enough, so I'm going to spread those holes a little bit more. And I did use an awl to punch these holes, which is what I showed you before. I did not drill them this time. I just used an awl to punch holes. I put it on a piece of foam so I could punch through far enough to make my holes larger, because just punching on a cutting board didn't allow the awl to go through far enough. So here are my sets of string for all of them. 6 sets of string, which is kind of madness, and 6 needles, and I had to thread each of those little needles individually, and I bound 1 page at a time. So here I am binding that very first page, which is basically, I wrapped a loop around it, tied it in a knot, and tucked the end under. And it's kind of similar to Coptic stitch binding, which is a really popular method, except that we're using different strings, like different threads, individual needles and everything for each hole. So this one definitely takes the longest. And I mean, it goes a little bit quicker once you get past the first page where you have to like tie everything off and go back and go through the cover. It does speed up a little bit, but this is definitely the sketchbook that took me the longest. I mean, the first one I was gluing, and the second one I was binding through all of the pages at the same time. And even though I did struggle with that one, this method definitely took the longest. So you can see at this point I had 3 of those lines going, and I ended up trying to keep the lines separate and just spreading them like in an arc across my table. And if you might have seen my Instagram story where I had all 6 of these strings all over they were just like taking up my whole table, and I was trying not to get them tangled. And this is what that looked like when I had the first of each sheet done. And now we're skipping to the end. That's how hard it was for me to try and film the binding of this one. But again, if you'd like to see the actual tutorial, you can check that out. Let's take a look at this one first. Now, this one, I was really happy with how the binding turned out on this one. It's similar to like a spiral bound sketchbook in that the strings kind of act as that spiral binding and the pages open completely flat. As with a spiral bound sketchbook, there's a little bit of space in between the pages, but the binding is super solid. Here's what it looks like from the side. Because the way it's bound and wrapped, it does create a little bit of space between the pages, so it's a little bit squishy in the middle where there is no binding, and it kind of causes the sketchbook to be a bit wider at the bound edge and a bit more narrow, like it has a bit of a wedge shape overall. But I'm really I like the look of this binding a lot. It's really, I look at it and it looks handmade and I really enjoy it. And now that it's been a little bit since I made the sketchbook, I'm telling myself, oh yeah, I would totally do this again, even though I know it took me several hours to sketch this, probably like 3 or 4 hours to sketch this intermittently going back and forth. But between the edges, like the raw edges on the outside and the stitch bound on the sewn edge, I really like the look of the sketchbook overall. This is how the other one turned out, this Japanese stitched sketchbook. I really love the look of the binding. I had issues with getting my string to be pulled through tightly, but that was just because ultimately the issues I had with this one were because my holes were not large enough. So here we can see the cover opens really, really nicely, and this is where we start to run into issues, and that is in the turning of the pages. Now, because I have watercolor paper, some of this is Arch's watercolor paper, and if I had scored or pressed with a bone folder these edges, that would have made it open and close easier, but it also would have kind of damaged the integrity of the paper, and I feel like my paper would have just kind of broken at that torn edge. So you can see here, it's just sheets that are bound together like 1 inch in, so they don't really want to open all the way. Especially the further I get into the sketchbook, the less they want to open, and even if I press, they don't. I know I could have pressed them ahead of time, like I said, but I was worried about the integrity of the paper. So if you guys have any tips for that sketchbook and opening the pages a bit flatter, even if it's in the binding step, just let me know in the comments. Here's the third one, the largest one, that A2 sized sketchbook that we did not stitch. It's just glued. And I actually, the inside edge that I glued, my shipping address was still on there. So fortunately that's sealed away and I don't have to worry about that being visible at all. I did leave the glued edge open so that it would be a bit more flexible and have more room to fold and to bend. So that glued edge is visible in this particular version of a perfect bound sketchbook. And to be honest, this is probably the one I'm going to go for as far as stitching methods, is that perfect bound one, because it was, 1, the easiest, and 2, gave me the results that I wanted. So I was able to open my sketchbook flat and I was able to cover it. And I don't get to see those stitches, which I really like, being able to see the stitches, but ultimately I really like the first one and the last one. So the individually stitched pages I really like, and the glue I really like, and I hope that you have liked this video. So okay, thanks guys for watching and just listening to my thoughts about these. I hope you don't mind that it's not an actual tutorial, but I hope you guys have enjoyed watching this video and kind of going through these 3 sketchbook making processes with me. All the links for all the things are in the description, and I will see you guys on Thursday. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Go make some sketchbooks. Okay, bye!